We are now beginning our panel discussion session with the three speakers who have just given us profound and stimulating lectures. Our director, Professor Toshio Kawai, will also join the discussion as the panel chair. Please welcome Professor Uchida, Professor Mare, Dr. Watanabe, and Professor Kawai.
Yeah, I would like to thank very much for very exciting contributions. And to begin our discussion, I'd like to make some questions and also comments to your presentations. First, it's very often cultural question, how to how to call, shall we take a North American style or Japanese style, which
let's do American style.
Okay, I will take American style. So for your presentation, Yukiko, the idea of interdependent happiness is very interesting. And then I have to say, the idea of happiness as such is or has been based on the individualism, but it's a very interesting idea. And of course, as Japanese, I can understand it very well, But I think we have to think about also the shadow side of the independent happiness, And your research showed the openness of community is very important, And I think there is two kinds of interdependence. One is closed interdependence, and the other is open interdependence. And the sociology makes a difference between totalism and holism. The holism means the group is open. So my family is open to the community, community is open to society, and society is open to the nature, and even to the land of dead. This is a holism. But interdependent happiness has a danger of to become a kind of closed community. This is one point. And also, you mentioned, in case of threat, interdependent, community can be very, helpful to face the threat. But if I think about the recent history of Japan, we suffered a lot because of the lack of empowerment. It was already the case when the gas terrorism happened by a cult in 1995. And all hospitals and people worked very well. So there were only 11 deaths. 11 persons were killed. But there is no, central function and no information. And again, in case of Eastern Japan earthquake, and again in case of COVID-19. So I think we also have to think about the shadow side of this community. And it's also interesting to hear about the research done by Masataka, and the threat can even contribute to well-being. And our team, I'm clinical psychologist and psychotherapist, so we made a survey about the effect of COVID-19. And our survey showed there are more improvement in the case of psychotherapy after the COVID-19. So the negative shock moved something, and this can, this is very problematic, but this can also contribute, I don't know why, but to the well-being. So these are questions and comments to your presentation. And thank you, Bertrand, for your very inspiring presentation. And I'm also interested in the history of the sanction and punishment. And if we remember, as a sanction punishment in medieval time in Europe, the punishment was not to punish an individual crime, but to have a ritual to recover the order which was damaged by the crime. For example, in Germany at that time, when a theft was caught, he or she was hung on an oak tree, and this is a ritual for the god, and not to punish the person, because if the person was not killed after a day, he was released. But the ritual was very important to recover the damaged order of the community. So I think that the idea of the individual sanction is a very modern idea. So in this sense, you showed very clearly the institutional sanction is better to be avoided, but it's more important the blame and so moral in the community. So I like the idea, but as a point, I think we are moving toward a new world. I mean, I would like to mention one example of sanction in the SNS, in the internet. This is not based on the law, but when someone put a communication in an SNS, Twitter, and this disturbs some persons. So there is a critical, critical statement, and this can be accumulated. There are some cases of committing suicide even, So this is a very strong social sanction, but not based on the law, and it's, you know, it's difficult to call it's a communal one, but it's a kind of new type. Yeah. So what do you think about this new trend? And also, there's a danger of fake news, yeah, fake statement, yeah. So how to cope with this new, new order? Yeah, I would like to ask you. And it's always problem because to your presentation, I think your name is Tsuyoshi. Am I wrong? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, you know, in Japan, we don't use a first name normally. Maybe it's only time to call you Tsuyoshi. So, yeah, it's fantastic presentation. And I think many audience thought about this similarity between human society, human community, and the coral, reef, and we can, So we like to learn, for example, how the coral or coral reef coped with in the history with a threat. Then I think we can learn how to cope with a threat. And because, you know, there is a difference between human race and the coral, but I think there is some hint, and this can also elucidate even some cultural differences. So, and also what I like, or what I find very interesting is there seems to be a kind of integration of life and death in the life, or it's difficult to call what it is, but in the life of a coral. But if we think about the pre-modern culture, there is an integration of death and dead in the community. You mentioned also Jomon time in Kikai Island, but we know that in Jomon time, the center of a community or village, I don't think we can call it even village, but the center, there is no building, there is no house in the center, and the dead came back every night and danced there. So the dead was integrated in the community, and they danced together. So in this sense, it's also interesting to see how life and death coordinate, or cohabitate, or I don't know, in case of coral, and we may learn from the coral. So that's all my comments and questions.
So maybe
Yeah,
let me
you.
answer first. Okay, thank you very much, Toshio. I feel a bit embarrassed. So they're very good questions, and this is a very important question, and maybe related to the implication of the interdependent happiness, and then also the value of the interdependence as well. So your first question about the dark side, shadow side of the interdependent happiness is maybe kind of closer to the community members, and they just think about the in-group members and not think about out-group members. That's I think like one of the risk of the interdependence. I mean, like my definition of the interdependence itself is the interdependence of the many other people, like not only in-group members, but also like a perception of the interdependence to the out-group members too. Like as my community studies suggested that I saw the graph of the figure depicted like subject well-being and social capital interdependence within the community promote the prosociality. But also this diagram depicts that openness is very quite important factor to promote the this circulation between and among the prosociality, interdependent happiness, and within group the social capital. So the openness might be for example, maybe for in the detailed example of the community members, for example, in the local community, they have more likely to be a close relationship, but sometimes they have visitors, and then also like they have some kind of the merchant related connections, like they can sell their vegetables and fish to the people, to the other societies. And after that kind of the interaction, they perceive that what is the value of their own cultural context, like a beautiful ocean there or very delicious food there, that without such kind of the open communication, this is very difficult for them to identify what is the valued structure in their own environment. And then also they don't have such kind of the shared reality. So like, so Tsushi's talk mentioned about some drama or narratives to convey some information. Maybe something like this is motivated to prevail their cultural values to the person who don't know that kind of the values. So maybe to interact and facing with such kind of the interpersonal or open communication, then we realize what we should talk about and what we should try to make some stories and the narratives to the connection. So I think maybe the broadly speaking, interdependent happiness or interdependence is very contains something like such kind of openness and flexibility towards the others in the other community members. But of course, we have to pay attention to the some cultures, like in Japan, especially in the low mobility context, they don't have any chance to interact with the other members, and then maybe their perception of the interdependent happiness is really getting closer and closer, and just in a closed mindset. So that's a kind of the shadow side, and maybe risk factor, I think. And then also your second question is about the threat. And again, there's some shadow side of the, such kind of the interdependent types of the challenges toward threat. Like, I feel like, for example, I showed some example of the COVID-19 situation. Each individual have wearing the mask, maybe because of they fear the reputation of the others, like Bertram say, like kind of they really worry about the reputation thing, but it's more likely to be happen in individual level. Rather, I feel like in the Japanese government and also like policy makers are very slow for the strong decision-making process. And that's really, the negative side of the lack of empowerment strategy. Of course, there are some hierarchical issues there. But for interdependent cultures, they really pay attention to each individual's kind of the motivation and then also the request and somehow like a wish and hope, and then try to keep the balance between those different sectors motivation, and then they really slow down the decision making process. So that's a kind of the very difficult social issues of the interdependence in front of the threat. But also, like as you mentioned, like very kind of for your client, for example, that after the negative shock, and they try to recreate their own kind of the energy or resilience. And that's quite, I think, important thing. And then also can be cross-culturally valued, such kind of the perception and notion and then the reorganization and transcendental cultural values may be connected to such kind of resilience. So I think maybe, again, the perception of the interdependence and the interwovenness in our planet, maybe connected to such kind of the resilience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Yukiko. Yeah. So now, Bertram, yeah, you don't have to remain in the interdependence. You can also, not only concerning my question, but yeah, if you would like to add or if you'd like to ask other, presenters, so please.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the very interesting question that I think sets us off in interesting connecting directions. I was actually really pleased to see the connections among the topics and the challenges. And to me, and I think I will get back to that, it keeps bringing up the idea of symbiosis. And the symbiosis is typically meant to be a positive thing, but it isn't always. Symbiosis is not necessarily positive. It can also be exploitative. And the virus that attacks us is in a sense taking our body as its symbiotic partner. And I think there's a way in which when two systems or units connect with each other, interact and encounter each other, all kinds of things can happen. And if the positive contact produces further consequences for offspring, for the greater environment, then it becomes symbiotic. And so to take on your questions, first of all, absolutely, punishment has many goals. And I think when punishment becomes a ritual, it takes on additional symbolic value that goes beyond it being sanctions. This is one way why you mentioned for the gods. Well, religion worked very powerfully by telling people what to do or not to do, by making them be fearful of the consequences of a very powerful and punishing God in many histories and many cultures. And in the Spanish Inquisition and many areas of Europe, these rituals of punishment don't give you a good chance of survival. Hanging from a tree for 24 hours is not necessarily a good chance to have a good time. It doesn't help with interdependent or independent happiness. So you can say, oh, the gods could have saved the good person, but didn't. Or when you are burnt on the stake and they say, well, clearly she can survive if she's protected by God, or you're being drowned and clearly you can get out of your shackles. None of these are, actual chances of seeing survival be justified, but rather it justifies the act of punishment. And I think that punishment as a ritual, especially engaged by the powerful on the less powerful, serves all kinds of functions and very little actual corrective, educational, reform function. Because if you torture and kill people, there's no reform. And the deterrence is also relatively unsuccessful, especially when people are being accused of being witches who haven't done anything, but merely because the neighbor said, I don't like her, she's a witch, and therefore they get burned. So this is the distortion and sort of the worst outcome of the idea of sanctions. Sanctions, the way I tried to describe it, should be the mildest necessary that achieve the real important goal for the community. But the larger the community becomes, the more hierarchical the community becomes, the more these sanctions take on other functions. And in the internet, this is one of the most fascinating topics to me, to think about how sanctions are being transformed and again distorted, and then sometimes even affirmed and maybe strengthened in the new social media, on the internet, in the interconnected global world. There are so many things to talk about. I want to just pick out a few things. The first is that in many cases, people are anonymous on the internet. And anonymity, as we know, typically disinhibits us. brings out the stronger, the less socially appropriate responses of anger and hatred and demeaning others, and the costs are minimal. Whenever the costs are minimal and you have disinhibition, destruction results, and the community cannot fight back. So in the cases where people are not anonymous, but they actually have their name on a Twitter account and it's verifiable and it really is this person, suddenly reputation becomes very important. And people behave much better when they actually are identifiable. And yet they still are more disinhibited on the internet than in real life. Face to face, our conflict when we have a disagreement would be much more polite, much more cautious. But if we send email to each other, we are much less controlled. So there's a power of the face-to-face. In small hunter-gatherer societies, you are always face-to-face. You always see each other, the other 30 people. It's all transparent. Nobody's behind the walls of their home. You constantly get the check from the community. Whereas among strangers, there's no interdependence. Doesn't matter whether I impose cost on the other person. There are no costs to me. And I can just, shut off my computer. So this brings, in a sense, out the worst in us and takes away all the positive control that a community puts on the individual. Humans are a mix of amazing capacities and terrible capacities. The individual itself can go in all kinds of directions. But if the individual is embedded in a group, then the group often can bring out the better parts of humans. Now, the group together can also be terrible. They can fight wars with other groups and so on. And this is, I think, this was very nice by Tsushi's sort of layered table. And I was trying to say that about happiness too. At each level, the individual, the family, the community, the nation, the world, humanity, there are positive forces and there are negative forces. And the question is, can the next layer bring the best out of the layer below? And there's really no sort of deep ethical truth. It's whatever works for the next layer to survive and to be successful will be the system of norms and pressures that are put on the lower level. We can sometimes say this was a horrible culture. Well, maybe from our perspective in our community with our norms, but if the culture survived for a long time, something worked well. As a final example, the Mayan culture and also the Aztecs for a while were incredibly thriving culture. But over the decades and centuries, they were more and more warmongering, killed more and more people, not only the prisoners of their wars, and they took over more and more of Latin America. They also killed more and more of their own people. And eventually, not only because of this, but eventually these cultures died out. And there are other examples that some historians of sort of cultural change have described where also, for example, the Spanish Inquisition and sort of the extreme forms of sects, at some point, the system will break down because it is not in good relation anymore to either the next layer up, to society at large, or it mistreats its own members. If the Mayan leaders and religious leaders kill most of their citizens or threaten most of their citizens or starve them, that culture will not survive. So this brings to me this kind of interaction between the layers, interdependence, not only at one level, but between the levels. And I think that that's also what Yukiko's description of independence and interdependence both have to be there, brings it up. We have both sides. I don't want to be all the time with other people and all the time worry about their happiness. I want them to worry about my happiness as well, but that's then my independent benefit, right? And when I commit norm violations, I have costs, but I also impose costs on others. And when I follow norms, eventually I should have benefits and others have benefits. It always sort of goes at both levels. Sorry, I took longer, but these are very exciting questions for me. And they link, I think, very well to the other talks.
Thank you, Bertram. Yeah, especially your addition to social media is very enlightening, and also you made it also very clear. There is interdependence among layers. Yeah, which makes the point very clear. Thank you. Yeah. So your turn.
Okay. Yeah. Today, I was really excited to learn the happiness and well-being and the cost for the human being and individual groups, and also relationship between the death and the life, and all things I always thinking to understand the world in the course. But that corals doesn't have brain and then mind, kokoro, but that just still similarity, also difference also. But that kind of similarities really, I'm really want to know how such that similarities happened during between such a two different type of animal and between the human being and the corals, the coral reefs. And now, but now I'm now in the learning also the different time window in the past, like Jomon period or the remote island in the Kikai Island. But the people, I think people still have such old link to the dead ancient person. For example, there's local people still gather together once a month to pray the ancient ancestor, and then pray, make dance together. For example, that also, but now it's a modern time in the human being world is changing. But if we think about back to the past, even the coral is very weak and sensitive. That's why they can survive with such, the change in the environment for long times. But also our human being, maybe we are very weak animal in the forest, for example. So we also are weak. And then to evaluate, then we can change, evolve. But evolution, we need to keep diversity. So but I don't know. So I would like to really discuss with what is the origin of kokoro, or so what is the driving force to develop, keep such relationship in the different kind of level, in individual group and also living part, dead part. Coral is living, keep living, but they deposit the skeleton. Skeleton is all, how can I say, not really living at this moment. But the dead part accumulate in the structure. That structure keep a living corals. That's kind of the multi-level structures. Similarity or differences. I really that today really moved to know that such very nice hint to understand the coral world. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we are getting new hints to on human society or human being. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I would like to ask each of you, do you have any additional comments or additional questions each other? Yeah. Yukiko.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I think maybe one question for Bertram and one question for Tsuyoshi. So the question for Bertram is the kind of I'm very the first of all, I'm very impressed by your talk, of course, and this is very provoking, and especially the punishment and the blame is kind of the cost and the benefit is very different, and then also like the reputation system is quite important for keeping the community-based social norms, and especially in the interdependent context, some kind of just worry about the reputation from others. So that's maybe not like a clear punishment, a clear blame, but still just thinking about supposing just or maybe there's some reputation that even if it's imaginary, that might be work and to regulate their own behavior. That kind of the ghost of the reputation system is so I was wondering, this is can be the one of the kind of shared reality thing. So do you think like as a individual level and the collective level, maybe such kind of there is some reputation system pursued, that kind of assumption itself works well, or maybe real reputation system there, like if they have something like have experience, like for example, person A say something very negatively about the person B, and if we listen such kind of the real reputation, then maybe being afraid of okay, maybe someone criticize me as other people do about the reputation. So that's a kind of the once again, my question is it very important to listen such kind of the real reputation system experience, or maybe just they just imaginary, like pluralism, like there's some reputation system there, and we have to worry about that kind of the shared reality is just fine to regulate our behavior as a group level.
Yeah, no, I think this divide between perceived and real is often, it varies. Sometimes the perceived is sufficient. Sometimes you need some grounding in reality to continue. If you have in your mind that you are a wonderful, intelligent person, for a while, this will influence your behavior. But at some point, after failing on tests or in discussions, that perception will break down. And so I think reputation too can be a perception. We might have as a group the perception that somebody we all know is very ethical and friendly. But after a while, when each of us might find some counter evidence, we may talk to each other and begin to break down this joint perception. And the perception must change at some point in the face of reality. But one thing that what you said really, I think, is important. Reputation is fundamentally based on our sensitivity of being positively responded to by others. The response can be nearness, can be a smile, can be admiration, can be cooperation, can be inclusion in a group. We are fundamentally social in the sense that any form of connection with others is typically felt to be positive. Because of that, reputation, that is the opinion of others, the declared opinion of others, admiration, being invited to a symposium, all of those things are positive reinforcement for us. But it doesn't have to be for good behavior. If I am a bully, my reputation as a bully reinforces me to be a bully. If my reputation is to be a brutal executioner, then I will keep brutally executing people. If my reputation is to be a fearless military leader, I will kill people, and even if they are on my troops, if they don't obey, I will kill them as well. Just because it's reputation driven doesn't mean it's necessarily good in any sort of general sense. It might be good for that group with that person for a while. The bully, sooner or later, will lose the reputation or the benefit of the reputation, because sooner or later people will exclude the bully, and then the bully has nothing to sort of be fed by anymore. So they have to adopt a new reputation, a new role, and then work on that. So maybe the bully is the reformed bully. It's the person who now has discovered love, has discovered kokoro, has discovered that other people are valuable. So now they have to work on that reputation, right? They have to act, they have to provide the reality to nourish the perception. The bully cannot just go around and say, you now see me as a good person, you now see me as a good person, you now see me as a good person, right? That's not going to work. You have to create the reality to change the reputation. But whether the reality is really always a good one, that's not a guarantee. Our previous US president had a very, very strong reputation. And about 40% of the nation very strongly supported that reputation and admired it. And the other 50% or so did not. So reputation as a mechanism by itself does not produce necessarily good outcomes, but it is very powerful because we do care about it.
Yeah, this is very important point, I think, because the reputation system itself is changing, and also they really, sometimes no like a unite reputation system, like of course left wing, right wing, and then also like some other types of the regulation goals, like subgroups of the one workplace, for example. They have each individual reputation system, but the integration of those kind of the system itself is very difficult, have some difficulty to reorganize how we regulate the behavior. So in that case, maybe the more explicit norm structure, the above and beyond the kind of the reputation system might work for integration. I don't know. This is very ethical and issues about that. And then also I really the reason why I asked this to Bertram is because I really interested in what is the reality, and then what is the kind of the shared norm system that effective to maintain our environment and then also regulate our behavior. So my second question is to Tsuyoshi about the drama. You're doing some drama, and maybe my interpretation of the sharing drama is showing somehow the shared narrative. And some norm structure might be included such kind of drama, because maybe for example, if we visited local area, there are several kind of short stories about including some moral structure and also reputation system there. Like, for example, a man did something wrong, and then maybe he might be punished by the God, something like that. So that kind of story is showing somehow what is a norm and what is the cultural values and what is a reputation system. So I think that's and both explicitly, implicitly, right? So this is because it's a drama. This is more likely embedded in the kind of the main story, but the character's reputation system or punishment system is very embedded in such kind of the norm structure. So what kind of the drama you are doing and try to show somehow like such kind of reality?
Actually, myself was mayor over 2,100 years. So, but we are playing in front of the mayor as islands. Anyway, but we can say that this is kind of fiction, the story, but also respect the narrative in the old story, in the islands. So, but I think this can be wrong, can be right way to the collectively we can act together to the future, but that's making drama. That process is still working for us, to encourage the people and the local residents and the younger generation can make comment to us after watching the comment. Oh, this is wrong, my community has a different story. Or for example, mayor, I don't think such a, that's always I'm thinking about money or something like that. But this is a good start point, opportunity to start to make a new story within all of us, including audience.
So it's interactive.
Interactive, yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So try to create a new story from such kind of the feedback.
Yeah. Now we are collecting the interview. So we decide to apply the strategy the next time from East Timor and Tokunoshima, Tanegashima, and 11 Islands in the Hokkaido. So we would like to try the different background of history, the culture, and the story. So, yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you.
It's a very interesting trial, yeah. And in I would say in all the time, we had a fixed myth or ritual, yeah, as story or narrative. But because the world is changing so rapidly, we are not anymore satisfied by the old stories. So I think it's a very interesting trial, and also we are very we like to get information now, good advices, but very often such a need is too quick, but in this sense, I like the idea of creating new narratives.
You can join to act story. Next.
Okay, thank you.
So I just realized something, Yukiko, your comment about drama. It seems so obvious now to think about it, but theater and drama is normative at two levels. You pointed out the level of norms embedded in the characters, what happens in the stories, the heroic ending to a tragic early event, the psychological laws really that are being played out. But in order to do this, you have to have a very strong norm structure of putting on a play. Like if I am an actor on stage and we're acting together and suddenly I realize, I need to call my wife. I can't just walk off the stage and say, hold on for a second, I need to call my wife, and I come back. Or I say, you know what, today, I don't like to wear my normal clothes. Can I just be in my shorts and my t-shirt? That would be a severe norm violation, especially when there's an audience there. Now you have the reputation of being the actor. Everything has to be very, very tightly controlled. And that's very much norm following. So this is, to me, fascinating that in order to display normative structures in storytelling, you need norms of storytelling. You need the norms of acting together and cooperating to bring out the old ways of our ancestors. You reenact this, but the reenactment is a very strong normative structure. So I think it shows that we are very good at it, or we can be, and we use this tool to create basically a lesson in morality, a lesson in cultural behavior, a lesson in relationships. But you don't see this among dogs and cats and chimpanzees to display a organized story to teach their children. This is a pretty amazing human thing to do.
But also, I think, that the structure is very important. This is theater, But as we discussed earlier, in case of social media, the boundary can be, damaged. It's not only virtual, but it jumps to the reality very quickly. So I think it's also the problem. Yeah,
and the idea is really that norms and rules, that's in my title, need to be enforced. We can tolerate a few norm violators every once in a while if it's not too serious. But if it constantly breaks down, if the norms are constantly being violated, they lose their nature of being norms. So if on the internet, you cannot enforce politeness or other things, there will be almost like this reinforcing way. It doesn't take many deviants to make a conversation go haywire. So what people now realize, okay, we have to have moderators. They are basically the norm enforcers. They're the police. So they shut down Twitter accounts. Well, again, our previous president lost his Twitter account. I mean, think about this for a moment. The United States president roused the nation with his stupid morning Twitter announcements and made them storm Congress, and then they finally shut him down. If you don't know that it's reality, it would be kind of a weird film, right? It's like, are you really going to make this film? This is ridiculous. This can't really be. Even in the US, this cannot be. But it happened. And that's in part because there was no other way to enforce any kind of norms. He could say anything, any lie, any accusation, any insult, didn't matter. And that was just remarkable. He broke so many norms, and by doing it consistently without any kind of enforcement, he almost shifted the norm system. Mm-hmm. And that's, to me, remarkable, right? That one person can have so much influence. But remember, he was at the top of the hierarchy. If anybody at the low level of the hierarchy had done that, at some point we would have kicked them out or put them in jail or ignored them, but not the president. Now he can have the power to change the norm system rather than being enforced against the norm system. And that, to me, is a very sort of, the internet helped amplify the hierarchical power that he had. Many presidents, in previous times sort of misbehaved, but not in the amount, the intensity, the consistency. And finally, it basically took to turn the key, turn it off, shut the server down. That's a pretty radical act. But if that's the only way we can enforce norms, sanction people like that, people do lose their Twitter accounts and lose their other accounts daily, thousands of them. So I think you find now, despite the disinhibition, you find the same attempts as a community, even though it's a community of billions, we need to find ways to enforce the norms, even on the internet. It's much harder though.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting that we both criticized first the Japanese government, afterwards also US. Yeah. Okay. Maybe we have some questions from the audience. Yeah. Shall we? Could you bring it to me or? Okay. Let's see. Shall we start from the top? I appreciate for Yukiko,
maybe me and Bertram.
Okay.
Yes, concept of the question is the concept of well-being is the various among nations. How can we overcome the difference here and get together in the world? So that's and what is a way to enjoy our never-ending story without blaming anyone? So that's maybe good for the Bertram to answer this question. And for my question, my answer is of course the well-being is various among nations, and this itself is very important. I think diversity. So of course there are sometimes the shared goal we have to have. For example, towards some orientation of the the kind of the environmental protection, for example, that's more likely to be, we have some shared earth system, and then we have a kind of the group member of all the people on the earth. So that kind of things that maybe our goal to protect earth itself is maybe the one unite think of goal, and then also the well-being toward to pursue this goal is quite important. But on the other hand, our goals and the connection is really multi-layered. So not only nation level, but also like a community level, for example, there are several types of the pursuit of happiness, and then also what kind of the happiness they are seeking for itself is very various across cultural context. That kind of the contextualization of the happiness itself is also important thing. The question is, of course, how to integrate those the different types and level of the well-being. Sometimes because it's a very conflicting each other, as Bertram said. So yeah, we have to have more likely to the flexible system like a coral. Maybe we can learn from the coral, like maybe some kind of the diversity and flexibility, and also the empathy and the sympathy towards the other goals is quite important. And then also maybe those things are maybe globally ethical is one of the solution to say something like the bottom line of the what is the good for the society and nations. How do you think, Bertram, for this question? Oh, you are muting. Please unmute.
Thank you. I think that the variability across communities, nations, eras, histories is very important. But there is something that holds together the way norms, values, well-being, communities interact. The specific content might vary, but I think that well-being is always going to be measured in some way by the continuity of a community, by sort of an optimal size of the community. And if many people are unhappy in the community, things will happen, conflict will happen, lack of cooperation will happen. And I think that's going to be similar from culture to culture, nation to nation. It might not be for the same reasons being unhappy. Maybe in an egalitarian society, we are very unhappy if people don't share with each other. If we are in a hierarchical society, we might be very unhappy if those on the bottom constantly challenge the ones on the top. You, of course, are in a very socially hierarchical culture, so you know exactly what happens when somebody who's lower, a student, disrespectfully talks to a professor. It happens in the US too, and we notice it, but it's probably not as strong of a signal of this is inappropriate, and it doesn't make the professor as unhappy as it might in other places. So I think there's variability, but it's often important to also recognize that at the system level, there are sort of commonalities. That's just how humans function. As to the second question, what is a way to enjoy a never-ending story without blaming anyone? I don't think that's possible. If we were perfect social beings, we wouldn't have to blame anybody. We would always hold hands and lovingly do everything together and for each other. It's just not going to happen. And I think it's an illusion to think that people will automatically do the right thing. Children don't automatically do the right thing. They need to be socialized. We don't beat children anymore in most cultures. We don't yell at them as much anymore, but we can't just let them do anything they want. We need to teach them norms and we need to give them feedback. And if the feedback is mild criticism or encouragement or reminder, look, we are a team here. You have to put some work into this if we want to do this together. So you encourage the social relational part and also how you think about each other. That's part of reputation. So I don't think we can have that enjoyable story without criticism, or at least without the threat or the possibility of criticism. To go back to my silly example earlier, if we are all acting together on stage, and we are on stage and we're in a sense acting out a symposium discussion, and one of us just in the middle of the sentence gets up and says, you know, I don't like this anymore. I want to watch football. Of course, that would deserve criticism. I would probably not be invited anymore. At some point, Yukiko will send me an email and she will be very polite and nice, but she will imply that this was not quite okay. If I didn't get this 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that these are the norms and you play by them, I wouldn't have gotten to where I am now. So I think criticism and blame and the possibility are healthy, but blame and criticism, I think, is one thing. Shaming people on the internet, punishing them, demeaning them in public, threatening them and hitting them and hurting them, those are very different things. This, I think, is not necessary in order to have an enjoyable togetherness. But we need corrective mechanisms. I think I'm quite convinced of that.
Thank you. Yeah, the time is almost running out. May we pick up one more question quickly, or shall we?
And also the one last comments from each person.
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Maybe better to
Better last
yeah.
comment. Yeah.
So last comments to each presenters.
Yeah.
So if
Maybe
you go.
shall I start first? Yeah, thank you very much for this symposium. That this is very the eyes opening and provoking. And one question I got is about the method of the remotely connecting to one significant others during the pandemic. I think that's one of the solution is like this. It's we can remotely connect each other, and but this is maybe based on the existed social bonding, I think. So the opening to the new, kind of the social interaction, just from the beginning of the using such kind of technologies, quite sometimes a bit difficult. But if we have the more, trust system and also the social capital each other, maybe we can easily connect and open our minds to the, and maybe the perception of the interdependence to the other types of not only significant others, but also like lots of the, the people in the world. So that's I think the new technology might help something to the new structure of interdependent happiness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kiko. So Bertram, yeah.
Oh, please unmute, Bertram.
I'm not used to this. I typically, when in a small group, I always keep everybody unmuted. I just typed a quick answer to one of the questions because I thought it was a very interesting one. And I'll just quickly summarize, and maybe that links together some of our themes, whether there are positive emotions that come with norm following. And the way I want to answer that is that norm following itself comes maybe with quiet positive emotions, being comfortable, safe, secure, and that's good. But I don't need to get praise all the time when I follow norms. That would be very cumbersome for our community. What norm following enables is many more positive emotions. If we follow norms, we can have a fantastic conversation, new ideas, inspiration. If we follow norms, we can build things together, create things together, write music together, play music together. Following norms is an enabler to unleash the power of human communities. And that's where symbiosis is not just sort of balance, but it is innovation. It's new things being possible. But if you have multiple agents interacting, in order for new things to emerge that are fighting entropy, that create novelty, you need coordination. You cannot have everybody talk at the same time. You cannot have everybody get all the questions and all the time. So there's a way in which coordination enables powerful positive emotions. And norm following itself is not the end, it's the means to the end of powerful human emotions and human creations.
Thank you. So,
okay, thank you very much for today. Coral never blend other corals. And yeah, for example, in a very different multi-type level, individual never blend colony group, and the group never blend the other group, and the coral reefs also. But just if one die, then other species just come. If coral reef is distinguished, then, for example, macroalgae come. Just, but that from hint from coral worlds, maybe there was some very fair and equal competition. So that's why every type of a coral and different kind of species has their own, how can I say, way to survive, have idea and knowledge, probably, and strategy. We had actually in the past time, they probably called a narrative or some story. So, but coral just, but the need, for the coral, the point of corals, they need to be very careful to feel about what is happening outside of us, I mean, the climate change, environment change. So they can eventually adapt, or for example, somewhat to predict the future. So, but actually, our ancestor actually had such nice, better strategy than the people in the other presents. So But I also want to learn more about the human being to understand the coral reefs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yukiko, Bertram, and Tsuyoshi, for your very exciting contribution to this symposium. And this is actually kickoff starting symposium for new projects. So we hope to continue, to have such an occasion in the future.